Good morning. Today, our guest is the lovely Julia Roberts. She's currently a member of Monash University's D Lab, and she's been facilitating design thinking workshops for well over a decade. Using its adaptable and flexible model, she's worked with students, volunteers, entrepreneurs, not-for-profits, startups, universities, professional groups, and small to medium businesses, as well as complex multinational corporations. So I think pretty much anyone and everyone from the sounds of it. Julie takes very much a hybrid approach to design thinking. So she draws a lot from art and design, history, social and critical thinking, and also business and education, as well as life. Since 2017, since 2017, Julie has divided her time between Australia and Mexico. And in particular, her time in Osaka has opened opportunities to work with the Cater Foundation, which is a not-for-profit organisation dedicated to fostering and facilitating local artisans and suppliers so that they can become part of the local and global economy, and really much focusing on that in sustainable ways to make sure that we're minimising their loss of identity and also reinforcing their local community. More recently, Julie's been able to use her experience and connections to facilitate an immersive study tour for design students where they get to work with local experts, artists, and intermediaries, which ultimately changes their perspective of the world. Thank you for joining us, Julie.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here with you, Tanya.
And I know you and I first worked together when you were working on gaining the Ashoka U Changemaker status for Seeker University back in 2014. So I know how much important social impact has in the work that you do. So thinking about the study tour experience as opposed to, say, a global exchange program, what is the difference and what sort of impact does the study tour experience have on the students and their student experience?
Okay, well, I should say that I think any sort of global experience is valuable.
Yes.
And really, worthwhile. But I've always been really interested in the transformative power of education. And I think the study tour, a well-designed study tour, has a particular capability of really helping young adults in particular at an important time of their life, open up their eyes to possibilities, help them to really understand their own values and their capabilities. And also I think we talk a lot about, finding your purpose as an important part of what we might choose to do in terms of shaping our careers. So I think at best a good study tour also helps the participants to identify what their purpose might be. And obviously these things are also possible through other experiences, but I guess what I try to curate through the study tour experience is a kind of intensive immersion into a whole range of experiences in a foreign country that I hope will not traumatize but transform a student and open them up to a whole world of possibilities.
Yeah. And I know for myself, when I did a field research study tour in South Africa, it was just a completely different experience. You suddenly saw people's lives in a very different way, and we're so protected, and even just on a daily social basis, we just don't see how people have different life experiences. And that study tour was very much about accessing communities and projects that we wouldn't have even thought of, and being able to work respectfully with those communities and just to talk to them and learn about their living conditions, the challenges they face, that we would, have no idea of otherwise. So, I think the more we have those opportunities, and I think very much the opportunity to understand how a respectful experience happens, I can't imagine how anything could be more important, particularly when you're going through that purpose, as you're saying.
I agree completely, Tanya, and I think a lot of the students I take have had they've been very fortunate. They've already had, overseas travelling experiences with their family, for instance. But I think that what you're identifying is the difference between tourism, in which we see, often, and I'm not knocking it, it's fun and enjoyable. You see a pre-packaged kind of snapshot, or sometimes I would say even a fairy tale story about a particular culture. And what we're trying to do in the study tour is really go beyond that. And I would hope that all students who go through the study tour experience come out of it with a greater understanding of responsible tourism as well, and an ability to understand that, cultures are much more complex and involved and intricate and interesting even than sometimes the tourist packaging of that culture might suggest. And I think what you're also identifying is that kind of going deep and finding out the things that we have in common with people that we might not have identified at all as or expected. Things that are done differently, the way people view the world, that opportunity for exchange. And I would hope at the best, the study tours are also a great experience for the local people who also get to engage with people from Australia. Often, many, particularly in Mexico, where I've done a lot of study tours, Australia is a very, very far away, mysterious place with kangaroos. So, they're surprised, for instance, when I turn up with students who are from Asian backgrounds or, different cultural backgrounds, and they start to understand the multiculturalism of Australia and get to share experiences. So I really hope it's a two-way exchange.
And when you're seeing those students then coming back, how do you see them, I guess, interacting differently once they're back in Australia and they're continuing their studies? Does it change how they approach their studies at all, or?
Well, I should mention in Oaxaca, for instance, some of the people that we work with are students who came down from America on a study tour and never went back.
Okay.
They actually stayed. So the ones that all so far, all of mine have come back. But I think, often what happens is the students that have been on that study group form an incredibly strong bond with each other. Several years ago, whilst at RMIT, I took many study tours to Vietnam, and we had teams of students who were based in Melbourne, working with teams of students in Vietnam, and they forged incredibly strong bonds. And out of that, a couple of students formed businesses together. Another couple married and have 2 children. And there's still really strong friendships, and a number of those students from those Vietnam projects have gone on to have careers in international development or working for not-for-profit organisations, who have really taken a whole sort of career direction from that experience.
Yeah, and I guess it would also be interesting to, be able to go back and sort of see how many of those have actually, when they've interacted with social enterprises and social enterprise opportunities, is how many have gone into that area, or at least supporting that area in some way.
Yeah, exactly. And I think one of the things that I do kind of push quite a bit in the study tour is, just the power of your choices, the power of your dollar, choosing to buy something from a social enterprise or something that's been ethically produced, as opposed to something that's being mass produced by a multinational corporation that may or may not be a good corporate citizen at the same time. So understanding the power that you can have to drive change, even in just your smallest choices. So yeah, I probably drummed that into them quite a bit.
Well, and I guess leading on from that, so how can we create more of these types of mutually beneficial opportunities where the relationships are respectful and not patronising, particularly in our current environment where it's unlikely that global travel is going to be opening, or at least accessible, within the next couple of years?
I think that's a really good question, Tanya. And one of the things that that I've always found a little bit amusing and perplexing and challenging is that often in Australia we don't see our own country as a place in which we could travel and explore. And for instance, I lived and taught in Darwin in 2002, 2003. And it was a place I'd visited, but when I lived there, I just discovered so much more about Darwin and the Northern Territory. And because of the high Indigenous population there, so much more about Indigenous culture than I had known before. And having also spent just a little bit of time in Western Australia, you know, for someone who grew up in Melbourne, going to these places is just as eye-opening and interesting and challenging as going to Mexico or Vietnam or Italy or wherever else you might go on a study tour. And I think there are all sorts of opportunities there that we just really don't take for granted. I think similarly with students who are really interested in that international development space, they often go look elsewhere. You mentioned Africa. That's often a country that comes up in my experience of students wanting to do something to help people in Africa. When we have enormous social issues here in Australia, we have enormous levels of poverty. You know, we have real challenges that students could contribute to addressing, you know, through, you know, thoughtfully designed, sensitively put together projects. But sadly, for some reason, there doesn't seem to be a lot of appetite to do that, but perhaps the current closing of the borders might change that a little bit. I don't know.
Yeah, maybe. And I think also I know when I talk to students, sometimes you'll have different ones who are like, oh, you know, I'm doing social work or whatever. I really want to work with Indigenous communities. You know, but they're sort of thinking of Indigenous communities as being somewhere remote.
Exactly.
And they're not thinking of the fact that there are Indigenous people within the community that they're actually living in. And quite often these are well-intentioned white people who are still going to take a I know how to look after you approach. And so trying to get people to think about what's actually in front of them and the complexities of it, but also the fact that these people, whoever it is that they want to help, actually know themselves and what they need more than we know what they need, and being able to listen and be open to that.
Exactly. And I think one of the things that I think is really important is even shifting that notion of, you know, wanting to help to what can I learn?
Yeah.
You know, what can I learn from this community, this group of people? How can I deepen my understanding of what is important to them and how they live their lives? And I think one of the things that was particularly interesting for me in the Mexican trips was a couple of the students commented on how before traveling to Mexico, they had been a little concerned about how they would deal with images of poverty and whether they would find them uncomfortable or challenging or whatever. And then through the whole process of being involved with people and meeting them and spending time with them, they've really shifted to almost, you know, one student expressed envy of the lives that these people led because the student particularly could see the richness of their lives and the strong familial bonds and the way in which, and I'm talking particularly here about design students, but for artisans in cultures like Mexico, making of things is like part of their lives. They do it all the time, you know. So it just opens up their understanding, and I think stops that kind of way in which we see us and them. You know, we're from a rich country, they're from a poor country, you know, all those kinds of things. So, yeah, I think really pushing the what can we learn rather than how can we help.
Yeah, and I think that's why, you know, competitions like the Big Idea are really good ways for students to really rethink about what they're learning, how they can apply it, and actually, you know, who, as you say, who am I listening to? What are their actual needs? Not this kind of preconception that we've got in a storybook somewhere along the line about what this
Yeah.
life is going to be like.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. No, I think I get very nervous about people who want to go and fix other people.
Yeah.
I think we have to be really careful about that. But also at the same time, not discouraging that impetus to be of value and to be of service to others. I think that's a great thing. But trying to put that more on an equal plane rather than a handout or a kind of more hierarchical approach to things.
Yeah, actually, it was interesting. A slightly different note altogether. But I was reading the other day in, like, today's environment is a lot of innovations are the ones coming out of Africa, because they're used to needing to innovate out of necessity, whereas for a lot of us, we're kind of almost bogged down with, things aren't working how we want them to do. Well, things don't work for them often anyway, so they've got to create things, and they're still able to create, whereas we are just really stagnated in that way. So yeah, it is, that sort of perception of they need help. Well, maybe we need help.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I think we kind of covered everything that I had planned to ask.
Yeah.
What is there some work that you'd like to share that you're doing at the moment? I know you're involved in lots of different things.
Sadly, not in terms of the study tours at the moment, because the study tour that I had planned this year obviously had to be cancelled because of the travel restrictions, which is very disappointing, as I'm having to endure a Melbourne winter rather than a Mexican sunshine. But no, I just think, I guess one of the things I would really love to see is also students encouraged to shape what they would like to experience as well. I mean, and I guess really that attitude that we've already talked about of looking around what's close. I like to play a game of being a tourist in Melbourne, because there's still parts of Melbourne that I don't know or understand or, haven't experienced, So looking in our local environment, I know, up in Rockhampton, you mentioned local Indigenous people. There are lots of really interesting Indigenous communities in your region. There are people, I'm sure people living out in the regions versus living in the towns have different things to offer. I mean, there are all sorts of ways in which you could develop exciting and interesting and worthwhile, valuable projects, just drawing upon your local communities. So, maybe that's the next place to go.
Yeah.
But in terms of current plans, I think, like a lot of universities, we are really in the midst of dealing with the impact of the coronavirus and trying to establish what that impact might be. And all our study tours have been cancelled for this year and for next year. We have a small campus in Prato in Italy. We're thinking there might be an opportunity to take small teams of students there for specific projects. But apart from that, we're really narrowing our activities down, which will change the university experience a lot. I mean, it's a very sad loss. But I don't know, maybe there are ways in which we can creatively use the system that you and I are using now. We're not co-located. You're a long way from where I am. And yet we're still able to communicate. So perhaps there are ways in which we could set up student communities that have that international component to them.
Yeah, and I mean, it's one of those things that technology now is so much more supportive for that online community development and that online student experience. Whereas if this was even like 5 years ago, we would struggle an awful lot more.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. In fact, I was reflecting this morning in thinking about, talking with you about the very, very first study tour I did, which was to Vietnam, which was when I think it was SARS. And we all had to have our temperature tested before we could travel. And then when we arrived in Ho Chi Minh City, one of the students had a fever and was put into quarantine. Um, so it was quite an interesting experience. Given the healthcare system over there, it was very interesting. But I have to say that student said that he thought he had the best experience of everybody on that trip because he really got the inside jive on it all. So
Yeah.
yeah. So I don't know. That's all just
And so
very
maybe
different.
it's, it comes back to how we choose to perceive the situation and what we decide we want to get out of it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for your time today. It's been lovely having a chat. And I know I'm organising a conference at the end of the year around social change and community, looking particularly future youth community stuff with their COVID thing. So
Fantastic.
I've got lots of great ideas now. That's good.
Excellent. That's fantastic.